Hello and welcome to our inDETAIL speaker series. My name is Brett Ward, the General Manager of International Marketing for Brickworks. On behalf of our team, I'd like to thank you for joining us this evening, whether you're joining us here in Australia or anywhere across the globe. In the spirit of reconciliation, Brickworks acknowledges the traditional owners of the lands on which we're all gathered and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. At Brickworks, we're proud to provide a platform for the sharing of ideas and discussion on topics that relate to our built environment. By live streaming these talks, we hope wherever you reside, you can be enriched and entertained by some of Australia's best design minds. Tonight, we're live in a Melbourne design studio and we'll now cross to the team in Melbourne to get the event underway. Please enjoy tonight's inDETAIL event.
Thanks, Brett, and welcome to today's Brickworks inDETAIL speaker series, coming to you from Brickworks' beautiful Melbourne Design Studio. My name is Daniel Moore, and I'm an architect and director of Open Creative Studio. Our speaker today is James Loder from John Wardle Architects, also known as JWA. John Wardle Architects was established in 1986 with a focus on architectural craft and the design of places that matter. Since then, JWA has gone on to win many awards across various scales, from small residential projects through to large institutional buildings. Some of those awards include National Australian Institute of Architecture Awards for Educational Architecture and Interior Architecture, the Rebra Award for International Excellence, and the Design Award for Best House Interior. Our speaker today, James, studied architecture at Deakin University and RMIT in Melbourne, earning his Master of Architecture in 2012. While James was studying, he also worked at JWA, and during that time he developed a taste for digital production and 3D graphics. After 14 years of working at JWA, James is now a partner and leading the integration of new technology with JWA's focus on material excellence and attention to detail. Thank you so much for joining us. Strap yourselves in, and I'll now pass over to our speaker, James Loder from John Wardle Architects. Over to you, James.
Thanks, Daniel, and thank you to Brickworks for the invitation to speak this evening. Whilst chatting with Daniel during the week, we talked about our deep investment at JWA and our craft of making, our history as a practice being built around a culture of sketching and drawing and model making. And it was interesting to reflect on how our processes have adapted and changed throughout the digital era, both within and externally to the practice. Even whilst putting this talk together last week, in the somewhat hectic moments of our NGVC competition, it was fascinating to see the blurring still between sketching and drawing and the digital modelling and prototyping that we do as a practice. And when thinking beyond the confines of our studio, we look to relationships with new types of craftspeople. And it's these relationships and these new forms of making that allows us to be inventive and experiment and to give character and identity to our projects. As Dan mentioned, I started as a student with John Wardle Architects almost 14 years ago, when we were a practice of only around 30. And actually my first encounter though was back in my year 10 work experience in 2002, where I did my 1 week working with the firm. And in a way, I feel like I've been part of the practice for almost 20 years in a way. And having grown up in a generation exposed with the emergence of digital technology, it really is a second language to me. So any tool or device that could contribute to our design process, I was helping bring into the practice. And through working closely with design directors, I developed my role as a leader in design through the translation and now integration between the analogue and digital. Now the youngest partner of 5, working with John Wardle, Steph and me, Megan Dwyer and Matthew Van Coy, we lead a practice of over 100 staff in our Melbourne studio. and 20 in our growing studio in Sydney. Our design culture has transformed, I think, over the last decade. We have a far broader participation of young minds, and these are supported by a network of mentorship across multiple layers of experience within the practice. Like many, the pandemic became an opportunity for us as we moved to working from home. Gone was the pin-up wall or the stand-up crit session, and in came this virtual world. Miro, which is one of the many online tools that we use and collaborate with, is this infinite virtual pin-up space that we held. It was the place for all of our design discussions. And in a way, it's absolutely transformed the way we work and now collaborate. There's no hierarchy in participation or one person holding the pen. In a way, it allows a broader group to join a conversation about design. And it also creates this extraordinary record of our design process. Every drawing and moment of ideation is captured visually in this digital map. We're still very much a practice that continues to draw on our residential work, which is the domestic scale, and we find it a really important way to connect with our clients across multiple project sectors. And it's also important for our staff to appreciate the material and detail systems across a range of building scales. So from a piece of joinery or furniture to the hallway of a house, or the prefabrication of a university ceiling. We're interested in how the qualities of, say, a house could be shared with that of a recital hall, or that of a heritage cottage, to the layered and contoured walls that define learning spaces within a university. And we question how we're drawing on the values of human inhabitation and material qualities of these domestic settings into some of our larger institutional projects. The first project I want to talk to, the Ian Potter Southbank Centre, explores our approach to experimentation and invention of a detail system. And it was actually quite late in the design process, during our design development phase, that we were balancing both the acoustic requirements of a music conservatorium set on a noisy road by using precast concrete, and asking ourselves what were the human scale moves that we were, and how we were connecting the building with its precinct. We're also conscious of its contextual setting of existing brick buildings that were part of the Victorian College of the Arts next door. And we need to consider the scale of the podium that was knitting into and contributing to that street wall along Sturt Street. And up until that point, we were proposing a surface of an exposed aggregate in precast. But we had our concerns for its overall legibility and reading. So there was this initial idea, halfway through design development, to just simply cast bricks into rather than onto concrete, almost like an oversized aggregate. And through early testing of the various shapes and sizes, I must say they weren't the most overly appealing form. We referred to these as the dog biscuits at the time. And in further experimentation, even Alan, one of our design leaders, took it upon himself to do his own tests in his backyard, casting broken bricks of various scales into concrete mix. However, we did have issues of the concrete bonding correctly, or the ability to control the overall appearance would have been quite difficult. And we do a number of these visual tests through iteration as part of our exploration to balance the aesthetic reading of a detail alongside the prototyping process. At the time, we had a relationship with Inax, who are a Japanese tile manufacturer, and something often we encourage as a firm to get out of our studio and into the studios of others and their factories. And John had just recently visited their factory in Japan. And through our engagement with them, we conceived this custom handmade ceramic tile that could be set within the concrete panels. So through a process of mapping digitally across the entire facade, we explored these varying densities that congregated around openings within this precast concrete. And the digital then was converted into this physical cast and mould, to then each of the 66,000 ceramic tiles were hand laid into panels as part of this overall patterned reading And we provide twice as many of the mould points, and this gave this blurring of digitised reading between tile, open mould and the concrete surface, even down to the finer grain of the exposed aggregate. And there's this wonderful pairing of processes, the handmade and fired tiles from Inax in Japan, to the prefabricated and beautifully crafted concrete panels in Bianco's concrete yard in South Australia. And this detail allows multiple readings of the building's surface from afar and to the street edge. Its tonal shift blurs the otherwise monotonous surface of the concrete, and they could almost be the reading of musical notes on a music box. And their overlay to a series of these deep apertures that evoke curiosity at this street edge, where these deep portals offer a view to a performance within, or the tiled wall itself, which is highly tactile as you run your hands along its surface, becomes a way for the passerby to engage with this building edge at the street. And these elements combined, they are quite important in the way we place a building within its civic setting. Even the animation of this massive circular window, in a way an exemplar of a new operational technology, as we definitely rely on our engineers to assist in resolving the complexities of such structural and performative requirements. For this massive rolling timber door that would ceremoniously open and close, marking the start or end of a rehearsal. And it's these moments of the animated, the tactile and the engagement that help give a building its identity and character, often even our client's identity, as we help set them apart from one institution to another. The Monash University Learning and Teaching Building was a project I worked on as an emerging design leader, and it was the largest institutional project we'd ever taken on at the time in 2014. And as university projects appeared to be increasing in scale with higher populations, we asked ourselves, how do we make a building of such scale that still engenders the spirit of learning and university life? So we're interested in how we could create this sense of inhabiting a campus within a single building, and also to draw on Clayton's contextual suburban setting. We created a series of these models where we explored this idea of a field of light, and that would help draw light deep into this very broad building and matte footprint building. So we were led to a series of these deep sawtooths as a roofscape, and that would protect against the direct sun ingress, whilst also drawing the southern light in. And this created an almost attic-like space, the entire top floor entirely clad in timber, floor, wall and ceiling, providing this sense of an inhabited roofscape. And working closely with Multiplex through the construction phase, we created a series of prototypes of smaller scales to understand the folded coffered infills that would make up these and filter light through, and also understand the modular construction systems of working at such a significant scale. And each of these were then prefabricated into massive timber trusses using an empty bunning shed around the corner, and then each one was trucked and craned onto site. So the massive scale is registered of these light coffers from different moments throughout the building, of this constant canopy of filtered light, even experienced up close from within a teaching lab to an open northern void of informal learning spaces. And this draws this attic-like quality of the top floor down with this large escarpment stair of student spaces. And this skylight as a roof unifies this field of activity beneath it. Its machined-like quality of geometric forms are in a way a counterpoint to these handcrafted brick volumes that sit beneath it. So there's this great pairing between an old and new craft of digital and analogue. And rising from the ground plane, these brick-clad forms evoke this sense of a small township or a landscape quality of a ravine. And that creates these streets and lanes and nooks and crannies for students to occupy. And we had to interrogate these carefully to understand some of the buildability aspects of their complex forms. Some of them were quite kiln-like in their formal shifts of double curves. So that process of the digital exploration paired with the prototyping and the application by hand, very much a side-by-side process. And working with the natural variation in firing of bricks, we played with the qualities of layered earth as we defined these contours within the overall forms. Almost like cliff faces that have been eroded over time, the walls weave to create different thresholds and enclosure, and peel apart to frame windows into teaching spaces or allow a stair to pass beneath it. And they create these sort of the high threshold of movement, human movement through, as students inhabit both above, beneath, to the edges. Areas of informal learning spaces are created around these settings. And in a way, all this contributes to creating that human-scale space within this landscape-like setting, all within one large university building. A project John and I worked quite closely on together was our exhibit called Somewhere Other, that was shown in the 2018 Venice Architecture Biennale. And this was an exemplar of us uncovering these new forms of craftsmanship and establishing quite unique relationships with the makers of our projects. It was certainly a project of many creative minds coming together for its inception. We invited artist Natasha Johns Messenger, and she brought her methods of distorting the perception of space into the project. But what I want to talk to are the collaborations between the makers, the fabricators, Jacaranda Industries, who have completed the fit out on a number of our university buildings, generously offered to build their piece in their Geelong factory. And throughout our engagement, I personally marvelled at their own forms of blurring the analogue and digital crafts of fabrication within their building process. So from a basic design model that I produced just simply for rendering the piece and understanding the form and material quality within the Arsenale in Venice, was taken by them and swiftly converted into a series of assembly drawings and shop drawings for the big CNC cutting machines. We didn't need to supply a single drawing. And it just emerged before our eyes in a matter of weeks. And that was enabled by the rapid production of these advanced machines that they use. But it's also their team of joiners. It's of incredible skill, each of them relishing in the task of working and crafting this such a carefully assembled piece. Each component was considered as part of a larger puzzle in a way, as it was required to be rapidly disassembled and then reassembled in Venice 3 months later. We engaged Derek Johns, who is a steel fabricator who had made a number of Simon Perry's public artworks. And Derek was to fabricate these fine 10mm steel rods that encase the overall timber shape. And this fine rod was representing remnants of a steel structure that originally held the piece together. And just using this diagram that I'd created to just simply visually identify each of these connection moments, Derek just simply eyeballed the diagram and, guessing the radius of each corner without a single drawing, welded and bent each of these steel rods. Very little intervention from our end. And he cut, welded and assembled with extraordinary skill, capturing absolutely every moment perfectly. It's a wonder to watch. So the piece was fully assembled and before being packed, disassembled, packed down into crates, and then set off on its very nervous journey on a ship across to Venice. On arrival in the Arsenale of Venice, Jacaranda became renowned amongst the other teams, prepared with every single tool imaginable, working around the clock. And the only thing slowing them down was a very important Essendon-Carlton match at 8 o'clock in the morning. But a very proud team with an enormous achievement. They, for me, the process of making and collaborating with a team like Jacaranda, it parallels the joy of seeing the built outcome. The next project I want to talk to is a commercial project in Brisbane, 900 Ann Street, which is located on a site owned by the Anglican Church, which has a number of existing heritage buildings. And I think this project is a good example and exemplifies our approach to an empathetic relationship with the heritage context through the use of a material and formal response. So a section through the site demonstrates this shift in massing to create a companion building as a mediating presence between the historic and new. And we sampled the tonal qualities of a mix of existing brickwork across the church buildings, which was set in this quite lush landscape setting. And working with barrel brick, we selected a mix of colours that would accompany the character of the old whilst also drawing on the colours of the landscape. And to achieve this sense of natural variation and tonal shift, we created a mix through a Flemish bond using these various colours. And this provided a particularly complex set out using a non-standard bond with a random mix of colours across multiple window setouts and angles. Quite a task. But it was one of our brickies on site who took it upon himself to shortcut the complexity of its actual construction, and rather than refer to our laborious drawing for every single colour, he just simply printed the pattern onto foam core and laid the bricks accordingly. So in a way, making its process of construction almost quicker than the time it took for us to document it. So the companion building, its form and configuration of windows is quite playful as a shape and form. In a way, it's a contemporary contribution to this suite of buildings that span 3 centuries of brickmaking. The next pair of projects I want to talk to are buildings under construction for the University of Tasmania and their Northern Transformation Project. They were designed entirely in lockdown last year, and for the first time we considered the complete life cycle of a project. And so working closely with industry and the university, we did intense research and analysis on the evaluation of a building's circular economy and looked to the reduction of embodied energy across these buildings. One of our initial strategic moves for the project was to shift an existing master plan of the campus into the industrial precinct of Inveresk. So 2 of our buildings are sited within the heritage fabric, with the larger of the 3 drawing the precinct across the river to the city. And our new pedestrian bridge, as part of this suite of buildings, has recently finished, which was certainly a much needed piece of infrastructure for pedestrians and cyclists that would connect Inveresk with the city. It was the vernacular of the industrial heritage buildings that were our starting point. From the 19th to 20th century, long rectangular gable forms of the Launceston Railway workshops to the early to mid-20th century square footprint or sawtooth forms of this high carbon era that were scaled for industrial production. To now this 21st century, our new buildings taking over these leftover irregular footprints, they in a way became hybrid forms and in an industrial vocabulary that was adapting for this new low carbon future. So the larger of the 2 projects, Willa Street, a research and teaching building, is derived from a pair of these gable forms that open up to navigate a corner site, creating this gateway to city and precinct. And the open centre between the 2 forms creates this light-filled atrium, lined with locally sourced Eucalyptus nitens, which is a hardwood plantation species. Once planted for pulpwood, is now an abundant resource in Tasmania. And the exterior of the building we've considered as a kit of parts in a way, this expression of assembly, and in doing so, contemplating its complete disassembly later in the future. So investing attention and inventiveness into the assembly of a standard building component, this helps in a way elevate the status of materials that are typical to an industrial building. So there is a rigour in their application. The deep 700mm wide profile of an Aramax panel, which is human scaled, is utilised as both roof and perforated screen walls. And its high spanning capability also then reduces the need for secondary steel. The profile of the Aramax panel is then extrapolated into a cast and mould for the lower precast concrete walls. And using Invisio concrete, this helps reduce the embodied energy by up to 30%. And even the punched waste from the perforations of the mill finished aluminium will then be recycled. So these uniform envelopes of these vast gable sheds peel apart and fray at their ends, almost exaggerated revealing the assembly of the building, the componentry of structure, the oversized gutters, the roof profile. And it's these moments of opening and pivoting these folding screens that reveal the student life and research activities within this vast industrial shed. And through the use of our digital tools, which has become very much a standard process for us, we now further understand the implications of our material selections and the volumes of each material we are proposing to use. So a better understanding of then how we can reduce our embodied energy. And currently we have achieved this extraordinary reduction of embodied energy across both buildings of up to 34%. And that's had little implication to the cost and budget. The River's Edge Learning and Teaching building, which is across the river, occupies an unusually shaped, almost triangular site next to the architecture building by 6 degrees. And in a way, it acts as a navigational marker within this precinct. Its pair of large picture-framed windows addressing the heritage laneways and views back into the university square. Its lower ground floor explores our fascination with perspective, the idea of being immersed in the centre of what is this very deep floor plan. We created these portals and lanes that enabled these connected views back out to the campus of this deep floor plate. And the confluence of these brick-clad walls containing classrooms created student breakout spaces between them, and also a great student space at the heart of the building. So on entry to this atrium space, the eye is drawn vertically as these deep timber skylights hang from above. And their forms emerge from these brick pods that sit beneath them, and they help bring and filter light deep into the building. Through our early prototyping of the brick, we've been exploring the idea of a larger joint that could shift the overall tonal reading of the walls from a distance, whilst up close, the colour of this hue-on brick by Austral Bricks picks up the tones of the internal timber lining throughout this atrium space. And working with Austral around the corner at their Longford factory in Launceston, for the first time we're using their carbon neutral brick, where instead of using gas, they use an industrial biomass product and a waste from the local sawmills to fuel their kilns. Amongst a series of other initiatives, this is assisting us greatly in reducing our embodied carbon for this building. I want to finish on one of our cultural experiences we undertake as a practice each year. Over a weekend, we take 20 staff down to John's property on Bruny Island to work across a series of small projects where we engage with a number of skilled trades. And it's just a great chance to step away from our computers. And it's a really important place, particularly for our young staff, to experience and learn the craft of making. We take up residence very happily in the two houses on his property, Shearer's Quarters and Captain Kelly's cottage. We come together to hear one of John's lectures on the environmental devastation of the Tasmanian salmon farming occurring along his coastline, or hear the stories of the many curious objects and ceramic pieces that he collects. But the rest of our time is spent learning the skill and craft of others. This team, led by Kevin Perkins, an artist and furniture designer in Tasmania, taught his team the fine art of wood whittling. So for each to whittle and carve their own Australian bird with extraordinary skill using these amazing whittling tools. And this year we invited Kev back for another weekend where we each made a seat carved from Tasmanian blackwood. And I think the character of each of them, somewhat reflecting our own aesthetic appreciations and the way in which a seat could function, was expressed in these series of quirky little seats. And intentionally, we try not to script the weekend too tightly. A few sketches and a loose design intent is often all that's needed, even for this bird watching and picnic platform. A couple of dimension set-outs was all we were required to order materials, and the rest was a form of, in a way, design and construct. We detailed as we built, making design decisions along the way. And certainly also working in some pretty extraordinary settings. We also built a bathhouse. We call it the bathhouse, but it's actually resourcefully using a $300 sheep feeder as the bath that sits on the edge of this cliff edge, and sourced an old wood-fired boiler that we got off Gumtree for heating the water. And the interior of the tub, which had this slight camber to it, was beautifully lined with leftover Inax ceramic tiles. So Eric and Marguerite, they spent their entire 2 days inside the tub forming their newfound skill of laying tiles. So it's not a bad spot for a bath. Although I hear it takes a few days to heat up the water though. The most ambitious project we've taken on was a brick step kiln. We invited ceramicists Ben and Peter Richardson from Ridgeline Pottery, who have experience in designing and building step kilns, which there essentially is a wood-fired kiln for pottery. For this one, we did quite a bit of preparation, as it was quite complex, building grasshopper models in Rhino to understand the number of bricks, the various cuts, shapes, and then locating of these 3 colours of this beautiful green glazed brick. So our staff learning the fine art of bricklaying and really appreciating the consequences of our design decisions, and then having that hands-on experience. So I think as architects, it's important that we balance our exploration into new materials, sciences and systems, and take these moments like this to recall and appreciate the traditional crafts of woodcarvers, furniture makers and ceramicists. To learn such skills, I think, beyond our daily practice does help us connect with the processes that form so much of the work we do as architects. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that presentation, James. You've now evaporated from your former location and you've materialised here for our Q&A. So thank you so much for that presentation.
Thanks, Daniel.
Really great.
It's good to be here.
Yeah. I mean, you did such a fantastic job about telling us about John Wardle Architects' approach to craft and materiality. How is that being combined with this new focus on new technology in the office? How is that starting to influence the process for you guys?
Well, it's certainly something that's evolved over my time with the practice. I work and lead amongst a group that we refer to as the Digital Transformation Group,
that's nice.
where we meet on a regular basis to review the various tools that are both analogue and digital that contribute to our design process. Mm-hmm. One hasn't certainly replaced the other. The digital tools, be it 3D rendering, digital model making, in a way it's the tool of choice that is a way for you to express your contribution to design. And I think, even reflecting recently on some of our projects, those that are for more comfortable drawing, and that may be occurring on a Miro board virtually, and that's still this kind of nice amalgamation between the analogue and digital. So I don't think one has replaced the other. They're definitely still being supported, but it's evolving in a way in which they're working together, I think.
Yeah, and what do you think the biggest benefit has been for the office? Because I think some practices might think, well, there's going to be a process of learning this new technology, and that might slow us down a little bit. And then other people just go, let's invest in it and go for it. What do you think has been the big great takeaway for you guys?
Well, I think bringing more technologies of different systems into the practice, I think, allows certainly a broader participation. I think that's been the biggest benefit. Gone are the days if you couldn't draw, you can't be part of the design process. So there are many different ways to contribute and be part of the conversation. I think in a way it's much more collaborative. There's no sense of the one author of a initiated sketch. It's through many people actually drawing over the same thing or idea. A digital model is often shared between a number of our design leaders as they work in different phases of a project. So I think that's the biggest takeaway for me, is this blurring of authorship amongst quite a broad diversity of experiences and thinking processes from each individual.
Yeah, that's great. And is there sort of a point with the digital technology where you have to sort of call it at some point and say, we've looked at this so far in the digital realm that we have to make this thing now as a prototype, or start playing in that way?
Yep. It depends on how audacious we're being with what we might be proposing. I think knowing the various sort of ways of buildability, we feel confident. We can explore it through the construction process. If it's something that is a little more beyond the realms of how we think it could be built, we would then earlier in the process look to either get a prototype done, understand how the material quality might respond if it's something that just hasn't been done before. And look, it's not, there's no script to the way in which we do this. There's no, now we're at a point in a project where we need to invent a new detail material. It's quite different across, given we work across so many different project types, scales, budgets, clients, you know within a project phase when it's right to perhaps find that moment that is defining the kind of character of a building. So it's quite a varied response, I think.
Yeah, and you also see that varied response with the different contractors that you're working with, where some people, like when you're working on the Venice project, they just saw that quite basic render and just said, I can see the whole thing, let's run with it. And then others say, can you give me more detail? I need something more for shop drawings and things like that.
Look, I've noticed a few times a lot of builders, even building our big institutional projects, they themselves marvel at building to the render. Like they like the fact that they've got the renders posted up on their site offices, and the finished outcome is actually what we envisaged in the 3D render. I think Jacaranda was quite unique because they went beyond that. They just simply took the kind of design intent and brought their appreciation for the detailed quality of the grain direction of the timber, where the joints could be located. We barely need to do any of that.
Wow.
And I think, and most architects will agree, a relationship like that with a builder is just invaluable to just the process of the making.
Yeah, because so much of what we're producing is drawings and visualizations of what the end result is going to be. People have invested so much time and money. So, have there been other types of technology that you can play with for clients or for builders where you can see that end result in a more thorough way?
I mean, so certainly with the introduction of virtual reality, in a way that's not a tool to impact the process of design. It's simply a tool to experience a moment of where that design is within its phase. And I think it can perhaps inform you the way in which you spatially and scale spaces, I think is important, which you obviously don't get from a card model or even a render. But I think what's interesting about the luxury of rendering and experiencing buildings in these early conceptual phases is a tendency to become perfectionistic and just constantly iterate and perfect. Back in the day, it was you just had to wait till it was built, and you couldn't change something then. You can't change material. These days, there is a sense, and we do try and create a moment that no, that's enough. Early within a phase, let's evolve it later in a phase, or just hit a whole point.
Yeah, because I guess there's a design element of or happy accidents during the design process, where as you're documenting things, they might sort of fall into place.
Yes.
And there's an element that's going to happen as well on site when you're being as experimental as you guys are with materials. That was a great illustration of the prototype for the brickwork down at the project down in Tasmania with the beautiful bricks that you had there. And the mortar looked far larger than a standard mortar joint. Is that something that you were starting to play with digitally and then started to prototype?
It was a way of us playing with this idea of trying to get a different tonal reading from a distance from the wall as a lighter appearance, and then when you came up close, you got the warmer tones of the brick up close. But it's extraordinary. Just a simple task of making the mortar a larger joint brought the issues of the structural engineers signing off on the mortar binding at a higher scale, or even the fact that using an embodied energy brick, then adding more mortar in, which is high embodied energy, was counteracting that. So sometimes you go through these experiments and tests, and then you do often circle back around and kind of move on with perhaps a more standard detail. But that's just part of that process.
Yeah, great. And we're seeing a lot of practices in architecture move towards carbon neutrality. How is that impacting John Wardle Architects as we're sort of moving towards a greener future? Are you guys building that into the process and also your material selection?
Absolutely. Particularly over the last couple of years, it's in every facet of the way we've been thinking. Having just a better knowledge of the embodied energy of materials. I think brick obviously is a material we refer to often as a lower embodied energy material, and trying to avoid some of the more metallic, higher embodied energy materials. But in a way, there are limitations. There's obviously cost limitations, buildability limitations. Stone, which is the lowest form, really, would be very expensive to clad an entire building of stone or a high-rise building. But then you can look at it a different way and actually look at just reducing the amount that you're building, avoiding the amount of cantilevers and massive steel that's holding up a building. So I think those projects for the University of Tasmania, that was a slightly different approach, where we actually looked at replacing concrete with Invisia, which is low embodied energy concrete mix, building the top floors with timber, and just looking at everything right down to the carpet selection, where we're getting that from. Was it recycled? So there's a body of work you can do that's kind of hidden behind the scenes that has a massive environmental impact, and we're trying to do that across most of our projects.
Yeah, it definitely seems like one of those areas of the services that architects are providing where that chain of custody for everything that goes into the materials is such a huge part of what you have to do on the amazing innovative buildings that you're doing. It's not just standard details and standard materials that come off the shelf. How have you been finding that's impacted the already high detail process that you're going into for finding things like ceramics from Japan that go in, get embedded into concrete panels? Has that made that process a little bit more difficult?
We would just change our approach to it. And I think, again, the University of Tasmania projects, where we were using off-the-shelf products, an Aramax roof sheet, but then we looked at how we could perforate it, use it as a cast and mould for concrete, and how do we create detail moments and kind of aberrations within an overall system that would create a kind of different character for the overall building. I think it's something we're probably going through at the moment, and we'll adapt to that change.
And you kind of created your own role, I'd say. It sounds like you created your own role at John Wardle Architects with, a focus on new technology and digital rendering and things like that. How have you seen, graduates and new architects in the practice getting mentored, and how do you sort of find their place in this practice that has a very great body of work and systems in place to produce great buildings? How are you sort of finding these graduates and new architects' place within that?
Yeah, no, and look, whilst I've carved a space for myself, it's carved a space for many of our younger design team, and even right up to our more senior designers, operating the way I do. So it's not just a space for me, but what we are doing is very much this quite direct mentoring of young design leaders across projects. We look to pair them with a more experienced design leader, and it's our design process is quite a complex thing to almost formalise. We've tried to do it in the past and write a handbook on a design process. It's never really worked. The best way to do it is just get stuck into the projects, work through different types, scales, different phases. It's really important for our young architects to, whilst understand the kind of conceptual basis, but then certainly a DD phase or design development, so important for understanding the implication of those initial ideas through how we detail material selection. So we try and give a really good breadth to the experience across multiple phases. Yeah,
and I think that sounds like a really great idea if you've got the senior staff working with the younger staff, that there is that crossover of knowledge.
Yeah, and there's this funny cross-pollination coming back up of the new skills that these young grads are bringing in from university. Just software and tech that it's even beyond me, and the way that they're able to iterate and output design content is extraordinary, and it's even paired with the analogue form of model making. There's some beautiful model making, card models, some of our graduates do, that also then pairs with the 3D printing. So there's this wonderful kind of diverse skill set within our design culture at the moment. It's great.
Yeah, and it sounds like strong iterative design processes. Really great for innovation and testing things and seeing what works and maybe isn't working quite well. At JWA, I mean, you've produced so many award-winning buildings. Do you find that that's giving you a lot more options to sift through, to then decide, what are we going to go forward with because there's so much great stuff?
It's something we've been doing at the moment is reflecting on this idea that we don't have to invent a new detail every time. Let's draw on the work we do. Let's become more rigorous and systematise in the way we approach a new project and look to the experiences and details we've developed on other projects and evolve them. I think that's important as we grow as a practice. It's something that will enable certainly a broader participation to be involved in, I think, rather than being so curated for every single moment. That's something we're going through as a growing practice.
Yeah, and it seems like going through COVID as an office as well, working with Miro and having to visualise everyone's work. That's been really great for you guys too.
Oh, it's so good, and it'll be fascinating as we come back into the office. I think a record of design will still exist on that virtual space. I think the nature of it and the way in which everyone can be involved that's been the most transformative for us.
Yeah.
It's a clear record of very accessible kind of image of the design process. It's not hidden away. It's not only a few people up on the pin-up wall. Everyone can see it.
Yeah.
So it filters right through our teams, all the way through the documentation. Everyone's contributing to the kind of design process.
Yeah, because I guess, like you're saying, traditionally some of the parts of the process are hidden, whereas now it's really great that you can see, where did that come from? Oh, it came from over there.
And the cross-pollination between projects. You can look on another project that you may have not once seen a moment on its design process. Now you can just click in, grab some content or some studies and material tests that they're doing on that project. Let's share that across with this one and not try and reinvent the wheel over here. So it is much more seamless, that sort of digital integration.
Yeah. And I mean, John Wardle, as I've said, a bunch of times, won so many awards, and it feels like winning awards is a big part of an architect's marketing. Also seeing, like, basically it's a form of peer review almost, to say, you tried this thing, you've done something innovative, and it's working really well. How do you think, how does John Wardle Architects assess success, even before any awards, I guess, have been given, when you're saying, this looks like something really special, this looks like a path that we should go down and see if that's where the meat is, that's where the juice is? How do you assess that?
It's interesting, those moments come at different phases in a project. As an example, the Conservatorium of Music, the big circular window was a moment conceived in an instant. I remember it sitting around the desk modelling it, and John suggested, why don't we put a big circular window in that would connect with this pocket park that we'd created next to it. So put the big circular window in, and how about we could roll a big timber door away, and that would create the sense of animation. And that moment was really done in a heartbeat in the competition phase and stayed all the way through. And and we just knew it was a move that was kind of, in a way, part defining for a project. And it's interesting to then counterpoint it to the tiles, which kind of wasn't until design development that we didn't feel quite right with just the precast at ground level. Went through all the different testing, and the time it took for that idea to evolve and get to a moment where we go, oh yeah, that feels right. That's in our own expectation, that is a success. Took a much longer time, and paired together, it is just interesting to see the variation of how ideas evolve. But I think measuring the success, certainly in our own minds, is experiencing the built form, but also I think it's those that experience the unexpected. That's the success, I think, of a project. And that might be, as an example, our Somewhere Other exhibition in Venice. Jacaranda had used this eucalyptus oil to just seal the timber. And it became the talking point for the opening at the vernissage. It was this piece that was, its idea was to connect you with Australian landscapes through a series of films of our work. And it also just viscerally had the smell of a eucalyptus forest. That was completely unintended. And we were there every morning rubbing a bit more eucalyptus oil on to keep that going. But I think it's moments like those the unexpected, that are the real success within a project, and probably, in part, some of the more rewarding ones. Yeah.
So the best outcome for John Wardle Architects seems to be, like a higher value brought by moments of joy.
Yep. And that are unexpected, that you perhaps didn't expect, the way in which people may engage with the building. I think that's the unplanned, it's the unexpected.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like, these sort of moments of joy mixed with the moments of joy that the end users have, and also the contractors that you work with, the people who are part of the design process. It's all sounds like this, great big mix of surprise and fun along the way. And is that something that was intended, I think, in the office, when you're like, look, if no one's having fun, then let's get out of here, guys?
Not always intended, but it's always a wonderful thing to just enjoy the process, as you say, with the collaboration with so many, as part of that journey, and experience it together at the end.
Great. All right, well, thank you so much for your presentation today, James. It was just so wonderful to hear more about what goes on behind the doors at John Wardle Architects, and we can't wait to see what's going to happen in the future for you guys.
Fantastic. Thanks, Daniel.
No worries. Well, thank you so much for joining us this evening at tonight's Brickworks inDETAIL speaker series, which we've been hosted wonderfully in the Brickworks Melbourne Design Studio. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time. See you later.